12-year-old Elijah Jackson wasn't supposed to matter. Just another poor black kid collecting cans before dawn, invisible in his too small clothes, silently helping his ailing grandmother survive on medicine they could barely afford. But beneath that quiet exterior burned a fierce intelligence that even he didn't fully recognize. When a school essay unexpectedly sent him to Washington, D.C., fate placed him next to Frank Dalton, a hostile Vietnam veteran harboring dark secrets. No one could have predicted that when Dalton's heart stopped mid-flight, Elijah's desperate CPR would resurrect more than just the old soldier. 6 gasped words would ignite a truth buried for decades by powerful men. Against impossible odds, this forgotten boy from nowhere would unearth a military conspiracy, restore his father's stolen honor, and prove that sometimes the smallest hands can tear down the tallest walls of injustice. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The morning air bit at Elijah's fingers as he rummaged through another recycling bin. His breath formed small clouds in the dawn light while he worked quickly, methodically separating aluminum cans from plastic bottles. This was his daily routine, up before the sun, collecting what others had thrown away, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. Just $3 more, he whispered to himself, checking his watch. School started in an hour, and he needed to be back home in 20 minutes to help Grandma Ruth with her morning medication. At 12 years old, Elijah Jackson shouldered responsibilities that would crush most adults. The recycling money wasn't for video games or candy like other kids his age might save for. It was for the prescription copays that kept his grandmother alive, the grandmother who had raised him since his mother succumbed to kidney failure when he was only 4. He stuffed the last of his findings into his backpack and began the 15-minute walk home. Their neighborhood wasn't the worst in the city, but it was far from the best. Paint peeled from most houses, and chain-link fences surrounded patches of yard that hadn't seen green in years. But their home, though small and weathered, was immaculate. Grandma Ruth made sure of that. "Cleanliness is next to godliness," she always said. "And we may not have much, but we have our dignity." Elijah slipped through the front door quietly, hoping his grandmother was still asleep. No such luck. "That you, baby?" Ruth's voice called from the kitchen. Despite her illness, she always managed to be up making breakfast. "Yes, ma'am," Elijah replied, setting his backpack down. "Just getting some fresh air before school." Ruth appeared in the doorway, leaning slightly on her cane. At 67, her body was failing her, but her eyes remained sharp and knowing. She took one look at Elijah's backpack and sighed. "Out. Collecting again. I told you, your job is to be a child and get your education. And my job is to take care of you too," Elijah countered, moving to the sink to wash his hands. "Did you take your morning pills?" Ruth's expression softened. "Not yet. Was waiting on you to read the labels. These old eyes aren't what they used to be." This was their dance, Ruth pretending she needed help reading labels she'd memorized years ago, and Elijah pretending he didn't know she was pretending. It gave him purpose, made him feel necessary. And in truth, on her bad days, she really did need the help. After breakfast and making sure Ruth had taken her medication, Elijah changed into his school clothes, the same jeans he'd worn all week, and a faded blue t-shirt that had once been much darker. He brushed his teeth, grabbed his homework from the table, and kissed his grandmother goodbye. "Remember what I always say," Ruth called as he headed for the door. Elijah smiled. "Kindness can save lives, sometimes literally." "That's right," she nodded. "Your grandfather was the kindest man I ever knew. That's why he was such a good nurse. And your mother, too." Her eyes grew misty for a moment. "Kindness runs in your blood, Elijah. Don't you forget it." The walk to Lincoln Middle School took exactly 18 minutes. Elijah timed it every day, knowing that if he left by 7:32, he'd arrive with 10 minutes to spare before the first bell. Timing was everything when your life balanced on such a precarious edge. As he approached the school grounds, he slowed his pace. This was always the hardest part of his day. The building itself wasn't intimidating, just a standard brick structure with colorful banners promoting school spirit. It was what waited inside that made his stomach clench. Well, look who it is. Garbage. Boy! The taunt came from Tyler Williams, a 7th grader whose father owned a local car dealership. He stood with his usual group of friends near the entrance. Digging through trash again this morning? Find anything good to eat? Elijah kept his eyes down and tried to walk past, but Tyler stepped in his path. Hey, I'm talking to you. What's that smell? Oh wait, it's just you. Tyler's friends laughed on cue. Leave me alone, Tyler, Elijah said quietly, trying to step around. Or what? You'll throw a soda can at me? Tyler reached out and shoved Elijah's shoulder, sending him stumbling back a step. That's enough, Mr. Williams. The stern voice belonged to Ms. Pearson, the 8th grade English teacher. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed. Unless you'd like to spend your lunch period in my classroom discussing respect. Tyler's smirk vanished. No, ma'am. Then I suggest you find something productive to do with your time. Ms. Pearson's gaze remained fixed on Tyler until he and his friends retreated inside. Elijah mumbled a thank you as he passed Ms. Pearson. Mr. Jackson, she called after him. A moment, please. Elijah stopped, worried he was somehow in trouble too. I read your essay on The Giver yesterday, she said. Your analysis of a society without memory was quite profound for someone your age. Elijah shifted uncomfortably under the praise. Thank you, ma'am. Have you ever considered entering the regional writing contest? This year's theme is Heroes of America. The deadline is next week. I don't think the winner gets a fully paid trip to Washington, D.C. for a youth leadership workshop, Ms. Pearson continued, and a $500 scholarship, $500. That would cover Grandma Ruth's medication for months. I'll think about it, Elijah promised. Ms. Pearson smiled. Good. I've left the application form on my desk. Stop by during lunch if you want to pick it up. The morning classes passed in a blur. Elijah excelled in most subjects but kept quiet during discussions. Drawing attention to himself only made the teasing worse. During lunch, while other students filled the cafeteria with laughter and chatter, he slipped into Ms. Pearson's empty classroom and took the application form from her desk. Later that afternoon, Ruth had an appointment at the VA clinic. She'd worked there as a nurse for 30 years before her health forced her to retire. Now she was a patient, waiting in the same rooms where she once provided care. Feels strange, doesn't it? She said to Elijah as they sat in the waiting area. Being on this side of things, Elijah nodded, looking around at the mostly older men and women waiting for their names to be called. His attention was drawn to an elderly white man in a wheelchair near the corner. Unlike the others who chatted in small groups, he sat alone, staring straight ahead with an intensity that seemed to dare anyone to approach. Who's that? Elijah whispered to his grandmother. Ruth followed his gaze and her expression changed subtly. That's Frank Dalton, Vietnam vet. Served in 2 tours, I believe. Lost his leg in the second one. Why is everyone staying away from him? Ruth sighed. Frank doesn't make it easy for people to help him. Pride's a powerful thing, especially for men who've seen what he's seen. As if sensing they were talking about him, Dalton's head turned slightly in their direction. His eyes, gray and hard as stone, locked with Elijah's for a brief moment before looking away. When Ruth's name was finally called, they walked past Dalton's chair. The old man was struggling to balance a stack of paperwork on his lap while maneuvering his wheelchair toward the pharmacy window. Need a hand with those, Frank? Ruth offered kindly. I got it, he growled, not looking up. The papers slipped, scattering across the floor. Ruth, despite her own frailty, bent to help gather them. It's no trouble. I said I got it, Dalton snapped, his voice sharp enough to make heads turn. Don't need your charity. Ruth straightened slowly, leaning on her cane. All right, Frank. Have it your way. She continued toward the examination room, but Elijah lingered a moment, watching as the old man struggled to reach the papers from his chair. There was something in Dalton's eyes that didn't match his harsh words. A flicker of something that looked like pain or maybe shame. Elijah had seen that look before, in his own reflection on the days when Ruth's medication made her too sick to get out of bed, and he felt helpless to make her better. The next day after school, Elijah went to the public library. Ms. Clark, the head librarian, had known him since he was small. His mother used to bring him for story time, and after she died, Elijah kept coming, finding solace in the quiet stacks and endless worlds contained within the books. "Working on something special today?" Ms. Clark asked as he settled at his usual table. "A contest essay." "About American heroes," Elijah replied. "Can I use the reference section?" Ms. Clark's eyes twinkled. "For my favorite patron?" "Of course." She led him to the locked glass cabinets that housed the library's most valuable books. "Any particular type of hero you're interested in?" Elijah thought for a moment. "Military heroes, I guess. Especially medics." An hour later, surrounded by books on battlefield medicine throughout American history, Elijah was completely absorbed. He read about Walt Whitman tending wounded soldiers during the Civil War, about World War II medics who parachuted into enemy territory, and Vietnam corpsmen who risked their lives crawling through jungles to reach the injured. One story particularly gripped him: a black medic in Vietnam who had crossed enemy lines to treat wounded villagers, then returned to save his entire platoon when they were ambushed. The book only mentioned him briefly, but Elijah wrote down his name: Thomas Harper. Over the next few days, Elijah started keeping a scrapbook of heroes, particularly focusing on medics who had saved lives in impossible situations. He worked on his essay during lunch breaks and after helping Ruth with dinner. The more he researched, the more fascinated he became with those who had the courage to heal in the midst of horror. On Saturday, Elijah accompanied Ruth to a local park where she liked to feed the birds. The fresh air did her good, she insisted, even if the walk tired her out. They sat on a bench near the pond, watching ducks glide across the water's surface. "You've been awful quiet these past few days," Ruth observed, breaking pieces of bread for the gathering birds. "Something on your mind?" Elijah was about to answer when he noticed a familiar figure at a bench across the pond. Frank Dalton, alone as always, struggling to open what looked like a can of soda with arthritic hands. "Be right back," Elijah told his grandmother. Then, walked around the pond's edge until he reached Dalton's bench. The old man didn't look up, still fighting with the can's tab. Elijah stood silently for a moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pocket knife Ruth had given him for his birthday. "Excuse me, sir," he said quietly. "Would this help?" Dalton's head snapped up, eyes narrowing with the same defensive glare Elijah had seen at the VA. But when he saw the knife being offered, something in his expression shifted, not quite softening, but changing. After a long pause, Dalton reached out and took the knife. He popped the tab with the blade's edge, then handed the knife back without a word. No thank you, no acknowledgement, just silent acceptance of the help. Elijah nodded and walked back to his grandmother, who had watched the entire exchange. "That was kind of you," she said when he returned. "Didn't do much," Elijah shrugged. "Sometimes, the smallest kindnesses matter most," Ruth replied, "especially to those who've forgotten what kindness feels like." That evening, after dinner, Ruth brought out an old CPR dummy, a relic from her nursing days that she kept in a closet. "What's this for?" Elijah asked as she placed it on the living room floor. "Time you learned proper CPR," she said, easing herself down beside it. "Every person should know how to save a life." For the next hour, she showed him the correct hand position, the right amount of pressure, and the proper rhythm. 30 compressions, then 2 breaths, she instructed. "Keep the blood flowing until help arrives." Elijah practiced until his arms ached. "Why are we doing this now?" he finally asked. Ruth's eyes grew distant. "I saved your Uncle Jerome with CPR once. Did I ever tell you that? Found him collapsed in the backyard. Doctor said if I hadn't known what to do, he wouldn't have made it." She patted Elijah's hand. "You never know when you might need it." 2 days later, Elijah submitted his essay to Ms. Pearson. He'd written about the courage of battlefield medics throughout American history, with special focus on those who treated everyone, friend or enemy, with equal care. A week passed before Ms. Pearson asked him to stay after class. Elijah's stomach knotted, certain he was in trouble for something. Instead, she handed him an envelope with a smile. Congratulations, Elijah. Your essay won first place. Inside was an official letter confirming his all-expenses-paid trip to Washington, D.C. for the Youth Leadership Workshop, along with a certificate for the scholarship. That night, he showed Ruth the letter, his excitement dampened by concern. "I can't go. Who'll help with your medication? Who'll make sure you're okay?" Ruth took his face in her hands. "Elijah Jackson, you listen to me. I was taking care of myself long before you came along. I can manage for 5 days. But, no buts. This is your chance to see something beyond these 4 walls in this neighborhood." Her eyes welled with tears. "You're going to be someone great, Elijah. Someone who makes a difference. So you're going. And that's final." The night before his departure, Elijah couldn't sleep. He checked and rechecked his small suitcase, making sure Ruth's medication schedule was clearly written out for Mrs. Wilson next door, who'd promised to check in twice daily. "What if something happens while I'm gone?" he asked Ruth as she tucked him in, a role reversal that made him feel like a small child again. "Then it happens," she said simply. "But what won't happen is you missing this opportunity because you're worried about your old grandma." She kissed his forehead. "Now get some sleep. You've got a big day tomorrow." Morning came too quickly. Elijah's stomach churned with a mixture of excitement and dread as he stood at the airport gate, clutching his boarding pass. Ruth had insisted on seeing him off despite her fatigue, and now she straightened his collar one last time. "I've never been on a plane before," Elijah admitted, his voice barely audible over the airport announcements. Ruth smiled, reaching into her purse. "I have something for you." She pulled out a small silver locket on a chain. "This was your mother's. She'd want you to have it now." Elijah's hands trembled as he took it. The locket was simple but beautiful, worn smooth by years of handling. When he opened it, he found a tiny photograph of his mother on one side, young and smiling, with a much younger Ruth beside her. "For luck," Ruth said, helping him fasten it around his neck. "And to remember, you're never really alone." The boarding call came and Elijah hugged his grandmother tightly. "I'll call as soon as I land," he promised. "You better," she laughed, wiping a tear. "Now go. Make us proud." The plane wasn't as crowded as Elijah had feared. He found his seat, a window spot, and stowed his backpack underneath. The seat beside him remained empty as other passengers filed past, and Elijah began to hope he might have the row to himself. Then, just before the doors closed, a familiar figure appeared in the aisle. Frank Dalton, maneuvering awkwardly with a cane rather than his usual wheelchair. A flight attendant helped him with his duffel bag, which he insisted on keeping near his feet, rather than in the overhead compartment. Dalton settled into the seat beside Elijah, without a glance of recognition. He wore a faded military cap, pulled low over his eyes, and stared straight ahead, as the flight attendants began their safety demonstration. Elijah's mind raced. What were the chances? The man he'd been quietly observing for weeks was now sitting inches away, trapped together with him in a metal tube hurtling through the sky. Should he say something? Pretend they'd never met? The silence stretched uncomfortably between them as the plane taxied down the runway. As they accelerated for takeoff, Elijah gripped the armrests tightly, his knuckles turning white. The sensation of being pushed back into his seat made his stomach lurch. "First flight?" Dalton's gruff voice startled him. Elijah nodded, not trusting himself to speak as the ground fell away beneath them. "Keep your eyes on the horizon," Dalton advised, not unkindly. "Helps with the queasy feeling." Elijah did as suggested, fixing his gaze on the distant skyline as it grew smaller. Surprisingly, it helped. "Thank you," he managed once they'd leveled off. Dalton grunted in response, then returned to his silence. 20 minutes into the flight, Elijah gathered his courage. "I'm Elijah," he said. "Elijah Jackson." Dalton's eyes remained fixed forward. "Frank Dalton," he replied after a pause, offering nothing more. Another silence fell. Elijah tried to focus on the clouds outside his window, but his attention kept drifting to Dalton's duffel bag, where a set of worn military tags hung from the zipper. The name was partially visible: L.T. F. Dalton. Lieutenant? Elijah murmured without thinking. Dalton's head turned sharply. What? Your tags, Elijah explained, pointing. They say Lieutenant. Dalton's expression hardened for a moment, then relaxed slightly. Long time ago, he said. Another lifetime. The conversation might have ended there, but the plane hit a patch of turbulence causing it to drop suddenly. Several passengers gasped. A baby started crying somewhere behind them. Dalton's hands gripped the armrests, his knuckles white, jaw clenched. His breathing changed, becoming shallow and rapid. Sweat beaded on his forehead. Sir? Are you okay? Elijah asked, concerned. Dalton didn't seem to hear him. His eyes had taken on a distant, glassy quality. He began muttering under his breath, words Elijah couldn't quite catch. Something about incoming and get down. A flight attendant passing with a drink cart noticed and paused. Is everything all right here? She asked, bending closer. I think he's scared of the turbulence, Elijah explained, not wanting to embarrass the man. The attendant nodded understandingly. It's just a rough air pocket, sir. Nothing to worry about. Can I get you some water? Dalton blinked, seeming to return to the present. I'm fine, he said curtly. Don't need anything. The attendant smiled professionally and continued down the aisle. Dalton wiped his forehead with a handkerchief, avoiding Elijah's concerned gaze. After several minutes of awkward silence, Elijah spoke again. Were you in the war? He asked quietly. Dalton exhaled slowly. More than one, he replied, his voice low and gravelly. Doesn't matter now. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a worn leather notebook. As he flipped through the pages, Elijah caught glimpses of handwritten names, dates, and locations. Some pages had been dog-eared or marked with paper clips. Are those people you knew? Elijah ventured. Dalton's thumb stopped on a particular page. People I served with, he corrected. Some made it home, some didn't. There was something in his tone that made Elijah's chest tighten, a weight of memory and loss that seemed almost tangible. Before he could respond, Dalton suddenly stiffened. His free hand moved to his chest, clutching at his shirt front. Sir? Elijah's voice rose in alarm. Dalton's face contorted in pain. The notebook slipped from his fingers as both hands now clawed at his chest. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but only a choking sound emerged. Then his body began to shake. Eyes rolling back. Help! Elijah shouted, jumping to his feet. Something's wrong with him. The plane erupted in commotion. Flight attendants rushed down the aisle. Passengers craned their necks to see what was happening. A call went out over the intercom. If there is a doctor or medical professional on board, please identify yourself to the flight attendants immediately. 2. Attendants helped lower Dalton to the floor in the small space between rows. One began loosening his collar while another brought the first aid kit. Is he having a heart attack? Someone asked. Check for a pulse, another voice urged. One of the attendants pressed fingers to Dalton's neck, then looked up with a grave expression. I'm not finding one. Is there a doctor? The other attendant called again, desperation in her voice. No one came forward. Elijah stood frozen, watching as the man before him, the gruff, solitary veteran who had occupied his thoughts for weeks, lay motionless on the floor. In that moment, Ruth's words echoed in his mind. Kindness can save lives, sometimes literally. Without fully realizing what he was doing, Elijah pushed past the flight attendant and knelt beside Dalton. I know CPR, he said, his voice shaking, but determined. My grandma taught me. The attendants exchanged uncertain glances but moved aside. Elijah positioned himself as Ruth had shown him, placing his palms on Dalton's chest. 30 compressions, then 2 breaths, he whispered to himself, and began. His first compressions were tentative, uncertain. Was he pushing hard enough? 2. Hard. Dalton's chest felt rigid beneath his hands, nothing like the practice dummy. You need to push harder, one attendant advised. Don't be afraid to break ribs. That's normal in CPR. Elijah nodded and increased the pressure, counting aloud. 1, 2, 3, 4. By 15, his arms were already burning. By 25, sweat dripped from his forehead. After 30, he tilted Dalton's head back, pinched his nose, and gave 2 rescue breaths as Ruth had taught him, then back to compressions. Again and again. Tears streamed down Elijah's face as he worked. "Please don't die," he whispered between counts. "Please, please don't die." Minutes stretched like hours. Someone said they were being diverted to the nearest airport. The attendants prepared an emergency oxygen mask. Elijah's arms felt like lead, but he didn't stop. "Come on, Mr. Dalton," he urged through tears. "You have to wake up. Please wake up." Just as Elijah was beginning to lose hope, Dalton's body suddenly jerked. A raspy gasp escaped his lips, followed by a violent cough. His eyes flew open, wild and disoriented. A cheer erupted from the watching passengers. The flight attendants rushed forward with the oxygen mask, securing it over Dalton's face. His chest rose and fell in labored but present breaths. Elijah sat back on his heels, exhausted and overwhelmed. Dalton's eyes found his, confusion giving way to recognition. With trembling fingers, he reached out and grasped Elijah's wrist. The oxygen mask fogged with each painful breath, but Dalton seemed determined to speak. He pulled the mask aside, just long enough to rasp 6 words that would change Elijah's life forever. "Your father saved my life too." The mask was replaced, immediately, but the words hung in the air between them. Elijah stared in shock, unable to process what he'd just heard. "Your father." But Elijah had never known his father. Ruth rarely spoke of him, saying only that he had died before Elijah was born. There were no photographs, no stories, no details, just an empty space where a father should have been. How could this stranger know anything about him? As the plane began its emergency descent, medical personnel were already waiting on the runway. Everything happened in a blur, Dalton being rushed from the aircraft on a stretcher, paramedics asking Elijah questions about what had happened, flight attendants praising his quick action. "You saved his life," one told him, squeezing his shoulder. "Not many adults would have had the courage to do what you did." But Elijah barely heard the praise. His mind replayed Dalton's words over and over, like a recording stuck on loop. "Your father saved my life too." Those 6 words held answers to questions Elijah hadn't even known to ask. And as he watched the ambulance carrying Frank Dalton speed away from the airport, Elijah knew with absolute certainty that nothing in his life would ever be the same again. The airport buzzed with activity as emergency personnel rushed Frank Dalton through the terminal. Elijah stood frozen in place, those 6 words echoing in his mind. "Your father saved my life too." Time seemed to slow around him as airport staff guided him away from the gate. "You did an amazing thing today, young man," a woman in a new airport security uniform said, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "The paramedics said if you hadn't started CPR when you did, that gentleman wouldn't have made it." Elijah nodded absently, his thoughts elsewhere. "Where are they taking him?" "Walter Reed Medical Center. It's the closest military hospital," she explained. "Someone will be in touch with his family." "But I need to talk to him," Elijah insisted, his voice rising with urgency. "He knew my father." The woman gave him a sympathetic look. "I'm sorry, but he needs immediate medical attention. Are you supposed to be meeting someone here in D.C.? Reality came crashing back. The youth leadership workshop, the scholarship, all the reasons he'd gotten on that plane in the first place. "There's supposed to be someone meeting me," he said, pulling the crumpled workshop information from his pocket. "From the American Youth Leadership Program." 20 minutes later, a harried-looking man with a clipboard found Elijah in the airport lounge. "Elijah Jackson, I'm David Morris, program coordinator. We heard about the emergency landing." "Are you all right?" Elijah managed a nod. "I'm fine." "What you did was incredible," David said, checking something off his list. "The workshop doesn't officially start until tomorrow, so we'll get you settled in the dorms tonight. The other students are already there." The drive to the university campus where they'd be staying was a blur. David kept up a steady stream of conversation, explaining the schedule and activities, but Elijah barely heard a word. His mind was filled with questions that only one person could answer, a man who might not survive the night. Once at the dormitory, Elijah was shown to his room and introduced to his roommate, a gangly boy from Michigan named Patrick who talked, excitedly, about the Supreme Court tour scheduled for the next day. Elijah nodded and smiled at appropriate intervals, but as soon as he could, he excused himself to call Ruth. He found a quiet corner in the dormitory lounge and dialed her number with shaking fingers. "Hello?" Ruth's voice was a lifeline to normalcy. "Grandma, it's me," Elijah said, his composure finally breaking. "Something happened on the plane." He told her everything, sitting next to Frank Dalton, the heart attack, performing CPR, and finally, the mysterious words the man had gasped before being taken away. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Grandma, are you there?" "Did he say?" Ruth's voice trembled in a way Elijah had never heard before. "Did he say your father saved him?" "Yes," he said. "Your father saved my life too." "Grandma, what did he mean? You always said you didn't know." "Much about my father." Another long pause, then the sound of muffled crying. "Grandma, what's wrong? Please talk to me. I can't." "Not like this," Ruth said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "Not over the phone." "But I need to check something first," she interrupted. "Let me call you back." The line went dead, leaving Elijah staring at his phone in confusion and frustration. 10 excruciating minutes passed before it rang again. "I think," Ruth began, her voice steadier now, "I think that man knew your daddy." Elijah sank to the floor, back against the wall. "How?" "You always said he died before I was born. That he was just someone you knew from the hospital." "I didn't tell you everything," Ruth admitted. I couldn't. It was too painful. Tell me now," Elijah pleaded. "Please." Ruth took a deep breath. "Your father's name was Thomas Harper." The name hit Elijah like a physical blow. "Thomas Harper? The medic? The one I read about in the library?" "You found him in your research?" Ruth sounded surprised. "Yes. He was a combat medic, one of the best. We met after the war, when he came to work at the VA hospital where I was head nurse." Elijah's mind raced. "But why didn't you tell me? Why keep it a secret?" "Because how he died." Ruth's voice caught. "The official story never sat right with me. They said he abandoned his post, disobeyed orders during a mission. But your father would never do that. He was the most dedicated medic I ever knew." Elijah could hear her moving around, the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. "I've kept a box," she explained. "Things I couldn't bear to look at but couldn't throw away either. Hold on." There was rustling, then a sharp intake of breath. "I found it," Ruth said. "A photograph your father kept. A group of men from his unit." A pause. "Elijah, there's a man here who looks just like an older version of the veteran you described. The name on the back says Lady Frank Dalton." Elijah's heart pounded in his chest. "What happened to my father, Grandma? The real story." Ruth's voice grew distant, as if she were speaking from the bottom of a well. "All I know is there was a mission that went wrong. Thomas was part of a special extraction team. Something happened, and when it was over, 8 men were dead. Thomas was blamed for abandoning his post, for not following orders. But you didn't believe it." "No," Ruth said firmly. "Never. Thomas would have died before leaving a man behind. That wasn't who he was. So what really happened?" "I don't know, baby. The military closed ranks, said it was classified. They gave me a flag and a medal and told me he died in an ambush 2 weeks later." Her voice hardened. "But they buried, more than my husband that day, they buried the truth." Elijah sat in stunned silence, trying to process everything. His father wasn't just some unknown figure. He was a hero, a medic, a man whose story had been hidden from him his entire life. "I need to talk to Dalton," he said finally. "He knows what really happened." "Be careful, Elijah," Ruth warned, her voice dropping to just above a whisper. "Truth is powerful and dangerous. Some folks work their whole lives to keep it hidden." After hanging up, Elijah couldn't sleep. He lay awake in the unfamiliar dormitory bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with newfound knowledge. His father had a name now, a face, a story. And somewhere in this city was a man who knew what really happened to him. The next morning, instead of joining the workshop's planned tour of the Supreme Court, Elijah slipped away to the dormitory's computer lab. He searched for information about Frank Dalton, but found little beyond a few military records that confirmed he had served as a lieutenant in Vietnam. Then he tried searching for information about his father. Thomas Harper, Vietnam medic, brought up several articles about decorated medics, but none mentioned his father specifically. Operation Windglass yielded nothing at all. With growing frustration, Elijah composed an email to Ms. Clark back home. Ms. Clark, I need your help. Could you look through the library archives for anything about a military mission called Operation Windglass from the Vietnam era? Also, any information about a combat medic named Thomas Harper? It's really important. Thank you, Elijah. As he hit send, his phone rang. It was Ruth. I've been thinking all night, she said without preamble. If that man, Dalton, really knew your father, then he might be the only person alive who knows what really happened. You need to find him. I'm trying, Elijah assured her. But how do I get to the hospital? And even if I do, they won't just let me see him. Use that brain of yours, Ruth said. You're smart, Elijah. Smarter than most adults I know. Figure it out. After hanging up, Elijah approached one of the program coordinators and asked about the status of the man who had the heart attack on my flight. The coordinator made a few calls and learned that Dalton had been stabilized and was recovering. That afternoon, while the other students toured the Library of Congress, Elijah feigned illness and stayed behind. Once alone, he called for a taxi using the emergency credit card Ruth had insisted he take. Walter Reed Medical Center, he told the driver, trying to sound confident despite his racing heart. The hospital was massive and intimidating. Elijah stood before the main entrance, suddenly unsure how to proceed. Security guards checked IDs at the door. Nurses and doctors hurried past with purposeful strides. How would he ever find Dalton in this maze, let alone get past security? Then he remembered something Ruth had told him once. In hospitals, if you act like you belong, most people won't question you. Taking a deep breath, Elijah walked through the main doors with his head high, following a group of visitors. No one stopped him. At the information desk, he heard a woman asking for a patient's room number and noted how the receptionist checked the computer. When it was his turn, he approached with what he hoped was a convincing smile. I'm here to see my grandfather, Frank Dalton. He was brought in yesterday after a heart attack on a flight. The receptionist typed the name into her computer. Room 312, East Wing. Visiting hours end at 8 p.m. Thank you, Elijah said, trying to hide his surprise at how easy it had been. The elevator ride to the third floor gave him time to consider what he would say when he saw Dalton. What questions should he ask first? Would the man even talk to him? Room 312 had a small window in the door. Elijah peered through it and saw Dalton lying in bed, attached to various monitors. He looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable than the gruff man from the plane. Taking a deep breath, Elijah knocked softly and entered. Dalton's eyes were closed, but they opened at the sound of the door. For a moment, confusion clouded his features. Then recognition dawned. You, he said, his voice a dry rasp. The boy from the plane. Elijah, he supplied, moving closer to the bed. Elijah Jackson. Dalton studied him with new intensity. Jackson. But your father was Harper, Elijah finished. Thomas Harper. My grandmother's last name is Jackson. I never knew my father's name until yesterday. Understanding passed across Dalton's weathered face. So you don't know, he said softly. About what happened? No, Elijah admitted, pulling a chair closer to the bed. My grandmother says the military told her he abandoned his post, that he disobeyed orders, and men died because of it. Anger flashed in Dalton's eyes. Lies, he spat. All of it. Damn lies. Then tell me the truth, Elijah pleaded. Please, I need to know who my father was. Dalton was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. I never forgot him, he said softly. He ran through fire to save me. And they let him die a traitor. What happened? Elijah pressed. Dalton's eyes met his, filled with decades of pain and regret. I did speak up, told them what really happened, but someone made sure my testimony disappeared. He tried to sit up, wincing at the effort. Elijah hurried to help adjust his pillows. There's a notebook, Dalton said once he was settled. Under the bed tray. I've been keeping it for years. Names, dates, memories I couldn't let go. Elijah retrieved a worn leather journal from beneath the tray table. It was the same one Dalton had been looking at on the plane just before his heart attack. There's an entry, Dalton continued, from the day after your father died. Read it. With trembling hands, Elijah opened the journal to where a faded ribbon marked a page. The handwriting was cramped but legible. May 17, 1971, they buried Harper today. No honors, no acknowledgement of what he did. Captain says we're to forget the whole thing happened. How do they expect me to forget the man who carried me through a mile of jungle with a bullet in his own leg? The same man they're now calling a coward? Wallace is backing the official story. Says Harper disobeyed a direct order, abandoned the extraction point. He's lying. We all know he's lying. Harper was the only one who realized it was a trap. He tried to warn them. When no one listened, he came back for us anyway. I filed my formal statement today, told the full truth. The clerk looked scared when he read it, said it would go up the chain. I don't have much hope. Major Harlow visited me in the infirmary tonight. Said if I knew what was good for me, I'd stick to the official report. Said, some things are bigger than one man's reputation. What's bigger than the truth? Elijah looked up, his vision blurred with tears. They lied about him. Dalton nodded gravely. Politics. The mission was unauthorized. We weren't supposed to be there at all. When it went bad, they needed a scapegoat. Your father was convenient. But why didn't you tell someone? After the war, I tried, Dalton said, his voice hardening. When I got back to the States, I recorded everything, made a full statement on tape. Then someone broke into my apartment and took everything. The tape, my notes, photographs. Left me a warning. Let it go or I'd be next. He reached into the bedside drawer with shaking hands and pulled out a small key. There's a storage unit, he said, pressing the key into Elijah's palm. Outside Arlington. Unit 247. I've kept things there the Army didn't want found. Things. About your father. About what really happened. What's there? Elijah asked, clutching the key. Evidence, Dalton replied, including a VHS tape. My confession, recorded in 1985 when I thought enough time had passed. I was too afraid to do anything. With it then. His eyes bore into Elijah's. Maybe you can. The storage facility was a nondescript building in a commercial area just outside Arlington National Cemetery. Rows of identical orange doors lined the concrete structure, each marked with black numbers. Unit 247 was near the back, away from the main office. Elijah's hand trembled as he inserted the key into the padlock. It turned with a satisfying click, and the lock fell open. He slid the door upward, revealing a small space filled with cardboard boxes, an old filing cabinet, and several military trunks. The musty smell of long undisturbed papers filled his nostrils as he stepped inside. Where to begin? There were dozens of boxes, each potentially containing pieces of his father's story. His phone rang, startling him in the silence. It was Ms. Clark from the library. Elijah? I got your email. I've been digging through our archives all morning. Did you find anything? He asked eagerly. Yes and no, she replied. There's very little about Operation Windglass in the public record, just a brief mention in a declassified report about failed extractions. But there's a footnote that caught my attention. Testimony withheld, Lieutenant Frank Dalton. Elijah's heart raced. That matches what Dalton told me. His testimony was suppressed. There's more, Ms. Clark continued. I found an old newspaper article about a medic who was posthumously reprimanded for disobeying orders. The name is there, Thomas A. Harper. That's my father, Elijah confirmed. But it's not true. Dalton says he was a hero, that he saved everyone. Be careful, Elijah, Ms. Clark cautioned. If what you're saying is true, people went to great lengths to bury the story. That means they wanted it to stay buried. After hanging up, Elijah began methodically searching through the storage unit. The first box contained old military manuals and maps, nothing immediately useful. The second held photographs, dozens of them, showing young men in jungle fatigues, some smiling, others staring grimly at the camera. In one photo, Elijah recognized Dalton, younger and standing on two good legs, his arm around another soldier. With a jolt, Elijah realized the other man must be his father. They had the same eyes, the same determined set to their jaw. On the back, someone had written, Harper and Dalton, Cam Bay, 1970. The filing cabinet yielded more treasures, dog tags, letters, medical reports. Elijah read with growing amazement about his father's numerous acts of bravery, the lives he'd saved, the risks he'd taken. How could such a man have been branded a coward? In the third box, beneath a layer of old uniforms, Elijah found what he was looking for, a VHS tape in a clear plastic case, labeled in faded marker, Confession, Dalton, 1985. He carefully placed the tape in his backpack, along with the photographs and several of the most important documents. As he was about to leave, something caught his eye, a small metal box at the back of the unit. Inside was a set of dog tags and a sealed envelope addressed simply, To my son, if I don't come back. With shaking hands, Elijah tucked the envelope into his pocket. His father's last words to him, words he was never meant to read, now rested against his heart. As he pulled the storage unit door down and replaced the padlock, a vehicle pulled into the lot, a black SUV with tinted windows. It moved slowly past the rows of units, as if searching for something, or someone. Instinctively, Elijah ducked behind a large dumpster, watching as the SUV came to a stop directly in front of Unit 247. Two men in dark suits emerged and examined the lock. It's been opened recently, one said to the other. We might be too late. Check the security cameras, the second man replied. Let's see who's been here. Elijah's blood ran cold. These men weren't here by coincidence. Somehow, they knew about the storage unit, and they wanted what was inside. As they walked toward the main office, Elijah seized his chance, slipping away between the buildings and running until his lungs burned. Back at the dormitory, he called Ruth immediately. Someone else knows about the storage unit, he said without preamble. Men in suits. They came right after I left. Did they see you? Ruth asked, her voice tense with worry. I don't think so. But they're going to check security cameras. You need to be careful, Elijah. More careful than ever. She paused. What did you find? Everything, Grandma. Photos of my father. Letters. Reports about missions he served on. Elijah's voice broke. And a tape. Dalton recorded his testimony about what really happened. Can you watch it? It's a VHS. I need to find a player. Elijah thought for a moment. Ms. Clark might have one at the library. Call her, Ruth urged. But be careful what you say on the phone. If these people are serious about keeping the past buried, they might be listening. After hanging up, Elijah called Ms. Clark again, choosing his words carefully. I found some old home movies, he said. But they're on VHS. Do you still have players at the library? Ms. Clark understood immediately. Yes, in our media room. If you can get them to me, I can digitize them for you. I'll find a way, Elijah promised. That evening, while the other students attended a lecture on constitutional law, Elijah snuck out again. He took a series of buses across the city, constantly checking to make sure he wasn't being followed, until he reached the post office. There, he carefully packaged the VHS tape and sent it overnight to Ms. Clark's home address, not the library, just in case. The next morning, Ms. Clark called, her voice tight with tension. I got your package, she said, and I've watched the tape. What's on it? Elijah asked, finding a quiet corner of the dormitory lounge. It's Frank Dalton, much younger, giving testimony about what happened during Operation Windglass. She took a deep breath. Elijah, according to Dalton, your father saved everyone in that unit. Dalton says, and I quote, Thomas Harper saved us all. They told me to say he disobeyed orders, but he was the only one who didn't. Elijah's heart swelled with pride and pain in equal measure. There's more, Ms. Clark continued. Dalton names names. Specifically, a Major Kenneth Harlow, who apparently gave the orders that sent them into a trap. According to Dalton, your father recognized it was a trap and tried to warn them but was overruled. When everything went bad, he went back in to save the men who'd been left behind. And for that, they called him a traitor, Elijah said bitterly. Yes. But here's where it gets complicated. This Major Harlow? He's not a major anymore. I did some searching online. He's now General Kenneth Harlow, a high-ranking Pentagon official. The Achabi implications hit Elijah like a physical blow. If Harlow had risen to such heights, he'd have every reason to keep the truth about Operation Windglass buried. And he'd have the power to do it. I'm sending you the digitized video now, Ms. Clark said. I've uploaded it to a secure server. The link is coming to your email. But Elijah, be very careful who you share this with. After receiving the link, Elijah forwarded it to Ruth, along with a simple message. The truth about Dad. Minutes later, his phone rang. I'm watching it now, Ruth said, her voice thick with tears. Oh, Elijah, your father. He was exactly the man I always told you he was. A hero. Through her sobs, she managed to say, Your daddy died for truth. That night, Elijah couldn't sleep. His mind was too full of everything he'd learned, everything he still needed to know. Around midnight, he slipped out of the dormitory and took a taxi back to the hospital. He had to talk to Dalton again. But when he arrived at room 312, it was empty. The bed was made, the monitors silent. A nurse passing in the hallway noticed his confusion. Are you looking for Mr. Dalton? Yes, Elijah replied. Where is he? The nurse frowned. He was transferred late last night, some kind of military medical facility. Very hush-hush. The orders came from above. Was he worse? Did he have another heart attack? The nurse lowered her voice. That's the strange thing. He was improving. His numbers were good. There was no medical reason to move him. She glanced around before adding, He's not sick enough for that kind of place. Someone doesn't want him. Talking. As Elijah left the hospital, the weight of what was happening settled over him like a shroud. His father's reputation had been deliberately destroyed. Evidence had been suppressed, and now Dalton, the one man who could testify to the truth, had been quietly removed from public access. The men who had come to the storage unit, the sudden transfer of Dalton to a restricted facility, these weren't coincidences. Someone powerful knew that Elijah was digging into the past, and they were moving quickly to stop him. But they were too late. The truth was already free, digitized and uploaded to a server where it couldn't be so easily destroyed. The question now was, what should he do with it? As dawn broke over Washington, D.C., Elijah made his decision. He would not let his father's story remain buried any longer. He would not let the powerful silence the truth. Somehow he would find a way to make the world hear his father's story. Opening his laptop, he began to type an email to Ms. Clark. I need one more favor. Do you know any journalists who might be interested in a decades-old military cover-up? It's time the world knew the truth about Thomas Harper. Morning light filtered through the dormitory blinds as Elijah paced the small room, his mind racing. His roommate Patrick had already left for the day's workshop activities, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the weight of his discoveries. His email to Ms. Clark had been sent hours ago, but there was no response yet. Waiting felt impossible. Every minute that passed was another minute the truth remained hidden. Another minute his father's name stayed tarnished. Elijah's phone buzzed with a text from Ruth. How are you holding up, baby? He typed back quickly, scared but determined. Have you watched the whole video? 3 times, came her reply. Your father was everything I always believed he was. Elijah clutched the phone tightly, drawing strength from her words. He hadn't yet opened the envelope addressed to him from his father. He wasn't ready. Some truths needed to be faced in the right moment. His phone rang suddenly, startling him. It was Ms. Clark. "I got your email," she said without preamble. "I've been thinking about your question, and I believe I know someone who can help. His name is Marvin Rhodes, a retired journalist who once covered military affairs. He actually wrote about Vietnam extensively." "Would he be interested in this story?" Elijah asked, hope rising in his chest. "I already called him," Ms. Clark replied. "I didn't give details, just said I had a young friend with evidence of a Vietnam-era military cover-up. He's intrigued. Is he trustworthy?" Marvin has spent his entire career exposing uncomfortable truths, and he's not afraid of powerful enemies. She paused. "There's something else. I did some digging into Operation Windglass. Years ago, Marvin tried to investigate it himself but hit a wall of classified documents and uncooperative sources. He'll be very interested in what you found." Elijah's heart raced. "Can you connect us?" "He's expecting your call. I'll text you his number." After hanging up, Elijah's phone buzzed with the promised contact information. He stared at it for a long moment, gathering his courage. This call could change everything, not just for him, but for his father's legacy. He dialed the number. "Marvin Rhodes," answered a deep, gravelly voice. "Mr. Rhodes, my name is Elijah Jackson. Ms. Clark from the Jefferson Public Library gave me your number. She said you might be interested in hearing about Operation Windglass." A pause. "That's a name I haven't heard in a long time. Why don't you tell me what you know, young man?" For the next 15 minutes, Elijah outlined everything he'd learned. His father's true identity, Dalton's testimony, the VHS confession, the storage unit, and the men who had come looking for it. Marvin listened silently, occasionally asking for clarification but otherwise letting Elijah tell the story uninterrupted. "You have the digitized video?" he asked when Elijah finished. "Yes." Ms. Clark uploaded it to a secure server. "Send me the link," Marvin instructed. "And those documents you found, can you scan them?" "I'll find a way," Elijah promised. "One more thing," Marvin added, his tone growing serious. "You need to understand what you're getting into, son. If what you're telling me is true, powerful people have worked for decades to keep this buried. They won't stop now just because a 12-year-old boy started asking questions." "I know," Elijah said quietly. "But it's my father's name. His honor. I can't just walk away." "Your father would be proud," Marvin said. "Send me everything you have. I'll start making calls." After hanging up, Elijah forwarded the video link to Marvin, then used his laptop to scan the documents he'd taken from the storage unit. The photos of his father, young, proud, standing alongside his fellow soldiers, brought tears to his eyes. This man, who had carried Dalton through a mile of jungle with a bullet in his own leg, was his father. A hero, not a traitor. As he worked, a notification popped up on his phone, an email from the youth workshop coordinators. He'd missed 2 days of activities now, and they were concerned about his whereabouts. A mandatory meeting was scheduled for that evening to discuss his participation issues. Elijah grimaced. The workshop seemed trivial now compared to what he'd discovered, but he couldn't afford to be sent home early. Not when he was so close to uncovering the full truth. He sent a quick reply apologizing for his absence, claiming he'd been ill but was feeling better now. He promised to attend the evening meeting and all activities moving forward. With that handled, he turned his attention back to scanning the documents. Just as he finished the last one, his phone rang again. It was Marvin. "I've watched the video," the journalist said, his voice tight with controlled excitement. "This is explosive, Elijah. Dalton's testimony directly contradicts the official record, and he names names, high-ranking names. Can you publish it?" "Not yet. Not without corroboration. One man's testimony, even on video, isn't enough to overturn an official military finding." Marvin paused. "But it's a start. A damn good start." "What do we do next?" I'm going to reach out to some of my old contacts, people who served in the same region during that time. Meanwhile, I need you to go back to the hospital, find out exactly where they transferred Dalton. We need to talk to him directly. Elijah's stomach nodded. The nurse said it was some kind of restricted military facility. Find out which one, Marvin insisted. And Elijah, be careful. If anyone asks why you're looking for him, say you just want to thank the man whose life you saved, nothing more. After promising to be cautious, Elijah hung up and headed back to the hospital. The same nurse from the night before was on duty, but she had no additional information about Dalton's transfer, only that the orders had come from above, and that the ambulance had arrived in the middle of the night. Frustrated but undeterred, Elijah was about to leave when he spotted a familiar face at the nurse's station. The flight attendant from the plane, visiting another patient who had fallen ill. During a subsequent flight, "You're the boy who performed CPR," she exclaimed when she saw him. "I've been telling everyone about you. Such bravery." Elijah smiled shyly. "Thank you. I was just checking on Mr. Dalton, but they say he's been transferred." The flight attendant nodded. "I heard about that. One of the paramedics who came for him mentioned Walter Reed Army Medical Center's secure wing. Very hush-hush. They wouldn't even let the regular staff assist with the transfer." Walter Reed's secure wing. It wasn't much, but it was something. Elijah thanked her and left, immediately calling Marvin with the information. "That's a start," Marvin said. "I have contacts at Walter Reed. Let me see what I can find out." That evening, Elijah attended the mandatory workshop meeting as promised. The coordinator, David, expressed concern about his absences, but seemed satisfied with Elijah's apology and promised to participate fully going forward. "We have a big day tomorrow," David reminded the group. A tour of the Pentagon, followed by a meeting with several military officials to discuss leadership in public service. The Pentagon, where General Kenneth Harlow worked, the man who, according to Dalton, had ordered Elijah's father and his unit into a trap, then covered it up by blaming the one man who had tried to save them all. Elijah's pulse quickened. Perhaps this wasn't just a coincidence. Perhaps it was an opportunity. Back in his dorm room, he called Marvin again. "The workshop is touring the Pentagon tomorrow," he explained. "Is there any way to find out if Harlow will be there?" "Leave that to me," Marvin replied. "I've been making progress on my end. I've located 2 other veterans from your father's unit who are still alive. One refuses to talk, but the other, William Carpenter, they called him Red, hinted he knows something. I'm driving to Baltimore tomorrow to interview him. What about Dalton? My contact at Walter Reed confirmed he's in the secure wing, but access is restricted to authorized personnel only. They've classified him as suffering from stress-induced psychosis, claiming his heart attack triggered delusions about his military service." "That's a lie," Elijah protested. "Of course it is," Marvin agreed grimly. "It's a convenient way to discredit anything he might say. We need more evidence, Elijah. Something irrefutable." After hanging up, Elijah finally gathered the courage to open the envelope his father had left for him. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the handwriting neat but hurried. "To my son, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home. I hope your mother has told you about me, about the work I did and why it mattered. I hope she told you I tried to save lives, not take them. There's something happening here that I don't fully understand. Orders that don't make sense. Missions that seem designed to fail. I've voiced my concerns, but no one's listening. Tomorrow we go out again. I have a bad feeling about this one. If my instincts are right, I'll do what I've always done, my job. I'll save who I can, no matter the cost. Know this. Whatever they might say about me later, I never abandoned my post. I never left a man behind. Remember that. I'm sorry I won't get to see you grow up, but I hope someday you'll understand why I had to do what I did." Your father, Thomas. Tears streamed down Elijah's face as he read the words, perhaps the only words his father had ever directed specifically to him. The letter confirmed everything Dalton had said. His father had sensed the trap and tried to warn others. When no one listened, he did his job anyway, saving lives including Dalton's. Elijah carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. Tomorrow, he would tour the Pentagon. Perhaps he would even come face to face with the man who had destroyed his father's reputation and robbed Elijah of ever knowing him. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it filled him with a quiet, determined rage. Morning sunlight glinted off the Pentagon's massive facade as Elijah and the other workshop students filed off their bus. Security was tight. IDs checked, bags searched. A guide assigned to escort them through the labyrinthine corridors of the world's largest office building. Elijah had barely slept, his mind churning with plans and possibilities. Shortly before, leaving the dorm, he'd received a text from Marvin. "Harlow is in the building today. Corner office, E-ring, 3rd floor. Be careful." As their tour progressed through displays of military history and technological achievement, Elijah paid close attention to their location, mentally mapping their route. The guide explained they would be meeting with several officers in the afternoon to discuss military leadership, but no names were mentioned. During a bathroom break, Elijah checked his phone and found another message from Marvin. Published preliminary article online. Title: The Boy, the Veteran, and the Forgotten War Crime Cover-Up. Included edited clip of Dalton's video, already getting traction. Elijah's heart raced. It had begun. The truth was starting to emerge. By lunchtime, their group had reached a cafeteria on the 2nd floor. As they ate, Elijah noticed several people hunched over phones and tablets, expressions concerned or confused. One woman nearby was watching a video with the volume low, but Elijah recognized Dalton's voice. "What's going on?" he asked Patrick, gesturing toward the growing number of people checking their devices. Patrick, always plugged into social media, quickly pulled out his phone. "Some story is going viral," he said, scrolling through Twitter. "Something about Vietnam and a cover-up. There's a video of some old guy saying the military lied about a mission." He looked up. "People are pretty worked up about it." The article was spreading faster than Elijah had anticipated. He excused himself to use the restroom again, this time calling Marvin. "It's everywhere," Marvin confirmed when he answered. "Military, forums, veteran groups, social media. The video clip has been viewed over 100,000 times in just 2 hours. Has there been any official response?" The Pentagon press office issued a statement calling the video unauthenticated and saying they're looking into the matter. But here's where it gets interesting. Veterans are coming forward in the comments. 3 so far who claim they served with your father. One wrote, "I was there. This is real." Elijah leaned against the wall, momentarily overwhelmed. "What about the man you went to interview? Red?" "He's agreed to talk on the record," Marvin said. "And Elijah, he claims your father gave him something before that final mission, something he's kept all these years." Before Elijah could ask what it was, a commotion erupted in the hallway outside the restroom. Raised voices, hurried footsteps. "I have to go," he whispered into the phone. "Something's happening." When he emerged, the tour group was being hastily shepherded toward the exit by flustered guides. Security personnel moved with purpose through the corridors, speaking urgently into radios. "What's going on?" Elijah asked Patrick as they were ushered along. "No idea," Patrick replied. "They just said the tour is being cut short due to an emerging situation." As they approached the main exit, Elijah spotted a television in a waiting area. A news anchor was speaking earnestly, a photo of Dalton displayed beside her. Below ran the caption, "Vietnam veteran claims decades-long cover-up of war crime." The storm had broken faster than anyone expected. Back at the dormitory, the workshop, coordinators called an emergency meeting. "Due to unforeseen circumstances," David announced, looking distinctly uncomfortable, "tomorrow's activities have been adjusted. The meeting with military officials has been postponed." Whispers rippled through the group. Most of the students had by now heard about the viral story, though none connected it to Elijah. In his room, Elijah found dozens of messages from Marvin, Ruth, and even Ms. Clark. The story had exploded. News outlets were picking up Marvin's article. Veterans groups were demanding answers. Congressional representatives were calling for an investigation. Elijah was scrolling through the updates when his phone rang. Ruth. Elijah, she said, her voice weak and strained. I'm in the hospital. His blood ran cold. What happened? Just got a little overwhelmed with everything, she said, clearly trying to sound stronger than she felt. The neighbors found me passed out. Doctor says my blood pressure spiked. This is my fault, Elijah said, guilt washing over him. I should never have started this. Don't you dare say that. Ruth's voice suddenly found its strength. This is about your father's honor, about justice. You did exactly what needed doing. But your health has been failing for years, she interrupted. That's life, baby. But what you're doing, that's legacy. She paused, then added softly, don't let them silence your father again. You hear me, baby? You fight. After promising to call again in the morning, Elijah hung up, his determination renewed despite his worry for Ruth. He returned to the flood of messages and updates. Marvin had been busy. His initial article had been picked up by a national news outlet, adding legitimacy and reach to the story. The Pentagon's dismissive statement about an unauthenticated video had backfired spectacularly when 3 more veterans came forward confirming Dalton's account. Most significantly, a former clerk from the Military Records Office had contacted Marvin, claiming to remember General Harlow, then Major Harlow, personally requesting that Dalton's testimony about Operation Windglass be sealed indefinitely for national security reasons. The story was gaining momentum by the hour. Social media was ablaze with the hashtag #JusticeForHarper. Protesters had begun gathering outside the Pentagon and the VA hospital where Dalton was being held. Late that night, Elijah received an encrypted email from an anonymous sender. The message was brief. There is a second recording. Your father sent it to his best friend before the mission. It's in a Bible he gave to William Red Carpenter. Find Red. Find the Bible. Elijah immediately forwarded the message to Marvin, who confirmed that Red was the very veteran he'd interviewed earlier that day in Baltimore. He didn't mention a Bible, Marvin wrote back, but he was drunk and evasive. We need to see him again. Tomorrow. The next morning, workshop activities were completely canceled. Most students took the opportunity to explore the city, but Elijah slipped away to meet Marvin at a coffee shop near Union Station. The journalist looked like he hadn't slept, eyes bloodshot, yesterday's clothes rumpled, but an undeniable energy radiating from him nonetheless. The story's everywhere, he said without preamble. Every major news outlet. The Pentagon's in damage control mode. Harlow hasn't made any public statements, but sources say he's cooperating with an internal review. What about Dalton? Elijah asked, still under lockdown, but the pressure's building to release him. Veterans groups are organizing a vigil outside Walter Reed. Marvin pulled out his laptop and showed Elijah the coverage. Dozens of articles, television segments, radio discussions. In just 24 hours, Operation Windglass had gone from a buried footnote to the center of a national controversy. We're driving to Baltimore, Marvin said, closing his laptop. Red needs to be sober when we talk to him again, and he needs to tell us about that Bible. The drive to Baltimore took longer than expected due to unusually heavy traffic. When they finally arrived at the homeless shelter where Red had been staying, they were told he had left hours earlier. Said he needed to get something from storage, the shelter manager explained. Seemed in a hurry. After checking 3 more shelters, they finally found Red sitting on a bench in a small park, clutching a worn leather-bound Bible. He was a thin man with wispy white hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent too many years outdoors. Despite the warm day, he wore multiple layers of clothing as if perpetually cold. You're back, he said when he saw Marvin. His gaze shifted to Elijah, eyes narrowing. Who's the kid? This is Thomas Harper's son, Marvin explained gently. Red's roomy eyes widened. Harper's boy. He studied Elijah's face intently. Yeah, I see it now. You got his eyes. We know about the Bible, Elijah said. About what my father gave you before the mission. Red clutched the book tighter. Kept it safe all these years. Tommy said if anything happened to him, I should keep it hidden. Said someday someone might come looking for the truth. His voice cracked. Been a long time waiting. Slowly, reverently, he opened the Bible. The inside had been hollowed out, creating a small compartment. From it, he withdrew a mini cassette tape. He recorded this the night before, Red explained, his voice thick with emotion. Said it was for his wife and unborn child in case the worst happened. Why hide it, Marvin asked. Because he also talked about the mission, about his concerns, about orders that didn't make sense. Red handed the tape to Elijah. He trusted me to keep it safe until it was time. Guess that time is now. Elijah stared at the small tape in his palm. His father's voice, preserved for decades waiting to be heard. A final testimony from beyond the grave. There's a recorder in my car that can play this, Marvin said softly. Are you ready to hear your father's voice? Elijah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. After all these years, all the lies and cover-ups, his father would finally have the chance to tell his own story. The truth that had been buried for so long was about to be fully unearthed. The tape player in Marvin's car crackled to life as the small cassette began to play. Elijah held his breath, hands trembling in his lap as he waited for the voice he'd never heard. The voice of his father. This is Sergeant Thomas A. Harper, Medical Corps, recording on May 2nd, 1971. The voice was deep, resonant, with a gentle, southern accent that reminded Elijah of Ruth. There was a steadiness to it, a quiet confidence that instantly made Elijah sit straighter. Ruth, my love, if you're hearing this, then I didn't make it back. I'm so sorry. You deserved better than a husband who left you to raise our child alone. A pause, the sound of a deep breath being taken. And to my child, I don't even know if you're a boy or a girl yet. I hope someday you'll understand why I had to do what I'm about to do. Elijah's throat tightened, tears welling in his eyes. His father had made this recording months before he was born. Speaking words meant only for him to hear decades later. Tomorrow we're being sent into the Quang Tri province on what they're calling a high-value extraction. But the intelligence doesn't add up. The coordinates we've been given are in a known hostile area, heavily defended. I've raised my concerns with Lieutenant Dalton and he agrees something's off. But Major Harlow has overruled us both. Another pause. Longer this time. If you're watching this, it means the truth is finally coming out. I never ran. I saved my men, and if they kill me for that, so be it. Elijah never stopped telling the truth. Elijah gasped. His father had said his name, had somehow known he would have a son named Elijah. Ruth always liked that name, the voice continued as if answering Elijah's unspoken question. Said if we had a boy, she wanted to name him Elijah, after her grandfather. There was the sound of movement, papers rustling. I've documented everything. About this mission, the orders, the intelligence reports, my own observations. I'm giving copies to Red and to Dalton. If I don't make it back, if something happens out there, they'll know what to do. A door slammed somewhere in the background of the recording. I have to go. Final briefing. His father's voice softened. Ruth, I love you more than life itself. And to my child, I'm sorry I won't get to see you grow up. But know that every life I save out there, I save for you. So you'll know your father stood for something. That he did what was right, no matter the cost. The tape clicked to its end. Silence filled the car. Elijah wiped tears from his cheeks, overwhelmed by emotions he couldn't fully name. Grief for the father he never knew. Pride in the man he had been. Anger at those who had stolen him away and tarnished his memory. He knew. He whispered finally. He knew the mission was a trap. Marvin nodded gravely. And he went anyway, because it was his duty to save lives. Then when it all went bad, they made him the scapegoat. The journalist's weathered face hardened. But now we have his testimony too, not just Dalton's. This changes everything. Back in the city, Marvin took the tape to a studio where it could be properly digitized and enhanced. By evening, both recordings, Dalton's confession and Thomas Harper's final message, had been uploaded to the same secure server and shared with select media outlets. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The Pentagon's initial dismissal of Dalton's testimony crumbled in the face of Harper's own words. Military analysts on news programs confirmed that the coordinates and details Harper mentioned matched classified records of Operation Windglass. Veterans. Groups mobilized, staging larger protests at the Pentagon and Walter Reed. The hashtag #Justice for Harper trended nationwide. Congressional representatives from both parties called for formal hearings. Late that night, Elijah received a call from the hospital where Ruth was staying. Her condition has worsened, the doctor explained gently. The stress has taxed her heart. She's asking for you. I'm in Washington, Elijah said, panic rising in his chest. I can't. I've arranged for a flight, Marvin cut in, having overheard. We can be there by morning. The overnight flight was a blur of anxiety and prayers. Elijah clutched his father's dog tags, which he'd taken from the storage unit, drawing strength from the connection to a man he was only now beginning to know. At the hospital, Ruth looked smaller than Elijah remembered. Frailer, the machines, around her bed beeping in steady rhythm. But her eyes lit up when she saw him. There's my brave boy, she whispered as he rushed to her side. I'm so sorry, Elijah said, taking her hand. This is all my fault. The stress, the excitement. Hush now, Ruth interrupted, squeezing his fingers with surprising strength. I've lived a long life, Elijah. Long enough to see my grandson become a man his father would be proud of. Her eyes moved to Marvin, standing respectfully by the door. You must be the journalist. Thank you for helping my boy. The honor is mine, ma'am, Marvin replied, inclining his head. Your husband was a hero. The world is finally learning that truth. Ruth smiled weakly. I always knew. Even when they handed me that folded flag and told me lies about how he died. She turned back to Elijah. Have you watched the tape? Elijah nodded, tears threatening again. He knew my name, Grandma, before I was even born. He was so certain. We'd have a boy, Ruth said, her eyes distant with memory. Said he could feel it. Wanted to name you after my grandfather, a man who stood up for what was right no matter what. Her gaze sharpened. Just like you're doing now. For the next 3 days. Elijah barely left Ruth's side, reading to her from his father's letters, showing her news coverage of the growing scandal. The hospital staff brought in a television so they could watch as the Pentagon finally announced a formal investigation into Operation Windglass and the subsequent handling of Sergeant Harper's record. On the 4th morning, Elijah was dozing, in the chair beside Ruth's bed when a commotion in the hallway woke him. A nurse appeared in the doorway, her expression a mixture of surprise and confusion. There's someone here to see you, she said. He was quite insistent. Behind her appeared Frank Dalton, in a wheelchair but alert and determined, a nurse from Walter Reed hovering nervously at his side. They let me out, he announced without preamble. Seems stress-induced psychosis isn't a convincing diagnosis when half the country's calling for your release. Elijah stood, stunned. How did you find us? Your journalist friend. He's waiting. Downstairs. Said he thought this reunion should be private. Dalton's gaze moved to Ruth, his expression softening. You must be Harper's wife. Ruth studied him for a long moment. And you're the man my husband saved, the one who finally told the truth. Too late, Dalton said, regret heavy in his voice. Decades too late. You're here now, Ruth replied simply. That's what matters. Dalton wheeled himself closer to her. Bed. I failed him for so long. Kept quiet when I should have shouted from the rooftops. He looked at Elijah. Until this young man saved my life and gave me a second chance to do what's right. From his jacket he withdrew a small box. I want you both to have these. They're my service medals. I don't deserve them. Not when the real hero's memory was tarnished for so long. Ruth shook her head. Keep them. You earned them. A smile touched her lips. Besides, Thomas wouldn't want them. He always said the only reward that mattered was bringing his men home alive. Tears filled Dalton's eyes. That sounds like him. The next day brought news that the Pentagon had suspended, General Harlow pending the outcome of the investigation. Marvin's sources reported that several other officers involved in the Operation Windglass cover-up were also under scrutiny. Meanwhile, veterans who had served with Thomas Harper began coming forward with their own stories, tales of his bravery, his dedication to saving lives regardless of uniform or nationality, his unwavering moral compass. A picture emerged of a man who had been extraordinary in his ordinary commitment to doing what was right. Ruth's strength continued to fade, but her spirit remained undimmed. She insisted on being kept informed of every development, her eyes shining, with vindication as her husband's name was gradually cleared. "He knows now," she told Elijah one evening, her voice barely above a whisper. "Wherever he is, he knows the truth is finally out." 2 days later, Marvin arrived at the hospital with momentous news. Congress had agreed to hold hearings on Operation Windglass and the subsequent cover-up. Both Elijah and Ruth had been invited to testify. "They want to hear from the family," Marvin explained, "about the impact of the false narrative, about your journey to uncover the truth." Ruth was too weak to travel to Washington, but she insisted Elijah go. "I'll testify by video link," she said. "These old bones can't make the trip, but my voice still works just fine." The hearing was scheduled for the following week. Elijah, Marvin, and Dalton flew back to Washington together, preparing their testimonies with the help of legal advisors. The story had captured national attention, with media outlets providing extensive coverage of what was now being called one of the most significant military cover-ups in modern American history. On the morning of the hearing, Elijah stood before the mirror in his hotel room, straightening the tie Marvin had bought him for the occasion. Around his neck hung his father's dog tags, a tangible connection to the man whose honor he was fighting to restore. The congressional chamber was packed with press, military officials, veterans, and curious citizens. Cameras flashed as Elijah took his seat at the witness table, Marvin and Dalton beside him, a screen set up to show Ruth joining by video from her hospital room. When it was Elijah's turn to speak, he approached the microphone with trembling legs, but a steady voice. He told the story from the beginning, the recycling route before school, the writing contest, the fateful plane ride, and the 6 words that had changed everything. "My father died protecting his men," Elijah concluded, looking directly at the panel of solemn-faced representatives. "And for 50 years, his name has carried the stain of a lie. I'm 12 years old. I never knew my father. But I know this. Being poor doesn't mean being powerless. One voice speaking truth can eventually be heard, no matter how many powerful people try to silence it." The chamber erupted in applause, forcing the chairman to call for order. Even some of the representatives were wiping away tears. When Ruth appeared on the screen to give her testimony, her voice was weak but her words were strong, resonating with decades of quiet dignity in the face of injustice. She spoke of the husband she had loved, the lies she had been told, and the vindication that had come too late, but was no less precious. The hearing lasted for hours, with Dalton providing detailed testimony about the mission, the aftermath, and the coordinated effort to suppress the truth. Military historians confirmed that records had been altered, testimonies buried, witnesses silenced. As the day drew to a close, the chairman of the committee made an unexpected announcement. Based on the overwhelming evidence presented, the Department of Defense had agreed to posthumously clear Sergeant Thomas Harper of all charges and restore his record to reflect his heroism. Furthermore, he would be awarded the Medal of Valor, the nation's highest military honor for a medical corpsman, in recognition of his extraordinary courage in saving his comrades at the cost of his own life. The chamber rose in a standing ovation. Elijah sat stunned, tears streaming down his face as he watched Ruth on the screen, her hands covering her mouth, shoulders shaking with silent sobs of joy and vindication. Justice, so long delayed, had finally arrived. But life's timing is rarely perfect. 3 days after the hearing, in the quiet hours before dawn, Ruth slipped away peacefully in her sleep, Elijah holding her hand till the end. "She held on just long enough," the doctor said gently, "to see your father's name cleared." As Elijah sat beside her still form, he whispered, "He knows now, And so does the world. The Medal of Valor ceremony took place on a crisp autumn morning at Arlington National Cemetery. A military honor guard stood at attention, flags snapping in the breeze, as officials, veterans, and journalists gathered to witness a wrong being made right after half a century. Elijah stood straight and tall in a new suit, Marvin and Dalton flanking him like protective sentinels. In the front row sat dozens of veterans who had served with Thomas Harper, many wearing their old uniforms adorned with medals and ribbons. The Secretary of Defense himself presented the medal, placing it reverently in Elijah's outstretched hands. "On behalf of a grateful nation," he intoned, "I present this Medal of Valor to Sergeant Thomas A. Harper, posthumously, for acts of extraordinary heroism in the face of grave danger, saving the lives of his comrades at the ultimate cost of his own." Elijah's fingers closed around the medal, its weight both physical and symbolic, the tangible recognition of a truth that had been buried for too long. When invited to speak, he approached the podium with steady steps, the medal clutched in one hand, his father's dog tags visible around his neck. "My father once recorded a message saying, 'Every life I save out there, I save for you,' so you'll know your father stood for something." Elijah's voice carried across the hushed gathering. "I stand here today, not just as Thomas Harper's son, but as the representative of a legacy that refused to remain buried, a legacy of courage, of sacrifice, and most importantly, of truth." He looked out at the assembled faces, some tearful, some solemn, all attentive. "This medal doesn't bring my father back. It doesn't give me the childhood memories I should have had with him. But it does one crucial thing. It restores his honor in the public record, just as it always remained intact in the hearts of those who truly knew him." After the ceremony, Frank Dalton, in his full dress uniform for the first time in decades, wheeled himself to Ruth's newly marked grave, adjacent to the now corrected headstone of Thomas Harper. With Elijah standing beside him, Dalton removed his medals one by one, laying them at the base of Thomas's headstone. "These were always yours in spirit," he said quietly. "The lives you saved, the courage you showed. No medal can capture that, but maybe these can serve as a small reminder of the debt I could never repay." Elijah placed his hand on Dalton's shoulder, a gesture of understanding beyond words. Together, they stood in silence, honoring not just Thomas Harper and Ruth, but the power of truth to emerge even after decades of darkness. In the weeks that followed, Marvin began work on a comprehensive documentary about Operation Windglass, the cover-up, and Elijah's journey to uncover the truth. The project quickly gained backing from a major production company, with Elijah serving as a consultant and narrator for portions of the film. The youth leadership workshop that had brought Elijah to Washington in the first place reached out to him, offering a full scholarship to their advanced program the following summer. The director wrote, "Your essay on Heroes of America demonstrated academic excellence. Your actions since then have demonstrated the very leadership qualities our program seeks to nurture." Meanwhile, Elijah's original essay was republished in a national magazine, alongside a new piece he wrote reflecting on his journey. "My father was a hero. So was the man he saved. But I think the real heroes are those who refuse to be quiet when it matters." Truth isn't just an abstract concept. It's the oxygen that allows justice to breathe. Sometimes that truth lies buried for years, decades, even, waiting for someone to dig it up and give it life again. The contents of the storage unit, Dalton's journals, Harper's letters, the mission documents, were donated to a new war memorial exhibit dedicated to forgotten medics and whistleblowers. A special section focused on Operation Windglass, using it as a case study in both the cost of cover-ups and the power of persistence in uncovering truth. Back in his hometown, life began to find a new rhythm. Ms. Clark, with tears in her eyes, placed Elijah's original scrapbook of military heroes in a glass case in the library's local history section. The display card read simply, "From Research to Revolution, How Elijah Jackson Restored His Father's Legacy." The house where Elijah had lived with Ruth felt emptier now, but not abandoned. Neighbors checked in regularly, and Elijah's aunt, Ruth's niece from Chicago, had moved in temporarily while legal guardianship was arranged. One afternoon, as Elijah sorted through Ruth's belongings, he found a small wooden box he'd never seen before. Inside was a collection of love letters from Thomas to Ruth dating back to their courtship. Reading them gave Elijah a new dimension of his father. Not just the hero who saved lives in war, but the gentle man who wrote poetry to his beloved, who dreamed of coaching Little League, who planned to teach his son to fish in the creek behind their house. These private glimpses were, in some ways, more precious than the public vindication. They were the father he might have known in another life. 3 months after the medal ceremony, Elijah was invited to speak at a youth summit in Atlanta. As he boarded the plane, no longer a nervous first-time flyer, he noticed people glancing his way, a few nudging their companions and pointing discreetly. His story had made him recognizable, a symbol of perseverance in the face of institutional power. He found his seat by the window, settled in, and pulled out one of his father's letters to read during the flight. A middle-aged man took the seat beside him, glancing over with a look of recognition. "You're him, aren't you?" the man asked. "The boy who saved that veteran on the plane, then uncovered the whole military cover-up?" Elijah nodded, a little uncomfortable with the attention. The man extended his hand. "My father served in Vietnam too. He never talked about it. Not until your story broke." Then suddenly he couldn't stop talking. It was like a dam breaking. He paused, emotion flickering across his face. "You saved more than one life that day, son." Elijah smiled, his hand unconsciously rising to touch the locket Ruth had given him before his first flight, the one containing photos of his mother and grandmother. Inside, he'd added a small picture of his father, completing the circle of family that had been broken for so long. The plane accelerated down the runway, lifting into the sky with the same mixture of fear and exhilaration Elijah had felt on that first fateful journey. But this time, there was something else too, a sense of purpose, of continuation. His father had saved lives through courage and sacrifice. Ruth had saved his father's memory through unwavering faith. And now Elijah had saved them both from the obscurity of lies and silence. As the plane leveled off above the clouds, Elijah gazed out at the endless horizon, feeling for the first time not the crushing weight of loss, but the limitless potential of legacy. He was his father's son. And now finally, the whole world knew what that truly meant. What would you risk to uncover a truth the powerful have buried? The answer might reveal your own courage waiting to be discovered. Like and subscribe for more stories that will challenge your heart and change how you see the world.